My name is Tom Ritter, and I'm going to be talking about some of the work that's been going on in the standards bodies, particularly the IETF, but also the W3C. And I find this stuff really interesting, and I came up with way more content that I could give you in an hour. So I wrote this really long white paper, and the slides that are in the conference proceedings will have way more content than you actually see here. I picked the things that I thought would give you the most value. So there's things that you can use right away to start protecting your users better, and also some improvements to TLS and some problems with it. And then finally, because it's kind of a really hot topic these days, is all the proposals to fix the CA system. I did a survey of the common ones that you've probably heard of, like convergence, and also the more obscure ones, like Mikai, and kind of drawing the commonalities out of them so you can take a look at any proposal and think about it a little bit more critically. There's another presentation going on at the same time as this by my friend Jeff Jarmock. He's also talking on SSL, a bit of a scheduling kerfluffle. If you're interested in SSL, you're probably interested in both talks. Black Hat is going to try and get the videos for our presentations out as fast as possible so you can get both talks in. So I'm going to start off talking about browsers and then go into TLS, particularly around identity management. A couple minutes on DNSSEC, and then finishing up with PKI, public key infrastructure, talking about revocation and all the fixes that have been proposed. And that bit at the top, rough consensus and running code, that's one of the tenets of the IETF, and I think it's a good place to start from, because I don't want to show you things that don't have running code behind them, because they're just kind of too pie in the sky and too far out there. So let's immediately dive in and start talking about fixes for your browser. So I'm going to start talking about content security policy, which is an HTTP header that restricts where content can be loaded from. So whenever you talk to a site, there's tons of third-party includes that come from maybe Yahoo if you're using YUI, comes from Google if you're using some of their script libraries, stuff like that. All of that is third-party content that's coming from different domains, and content security policy is a way for you to whitelist where those domains, what domains are permissible for what content. And this is currently in Firefox, Chrome, and Safari, and it's in IE 10. Hopefully it's coming to the previous versions of IE soon. And really this is designed to mitigate the potential for damage in cross-site scripting or any type of HTML injection. A good example of this is WordPress compromises. So if there's an O-day or a 45-day bug in WordPress, and there's a script that just drives around the internet compromising templates, they usually just drop in an iframe or a script at the bottom of the template. Content security policy will block that outright, because you're not going to permit completely random domains that you've never heard from loading content. And these are the things, the different levels of granularity you have. So images, of course, but also style sheets, JavaScript files, any iframes in your page, fonts, audio, video, and then any AJAX requests going out. And this is what the header looks like. So this says, allow images from any domain on the web, allow JavaScript files from api.google over SSL, and from my current domain. And then everything else, so style sheets, iframes, audio, video, only from the current domain. That's what default source says. Everything else, and self means the current domain. And in my opinion, one of the coolest things about content security policy, or CSP, I'm going to start using the acronym, is its reporting functionality. So if there's a violation on your site, so it tries to load JavaScript from a bad domain in a persistent cross-site scripting attack, the browser will block it, and it can notify you about it as you being the site administrator. So you can specify a report URI. It'll send something that looks like this. It'll say, this is what I blocked. This is the policy that it violated. Here's some more information that's useful for you. And this is really powerful, especially because there's a corresponding header, content security policy report only. That only does reporting. So you can deploy content security policy report only with no impact to your users. You can put anything you want in there, and the users will start telling you, I violated these directives that you said, but it won't block it. So your site remains unchanged for the users. So you could go home tonight and put out content security policy report only, and the domains that you think your site is loading stuff from, So if you think you're loading stuff from Google and Google alone, you can put that in. And all your users will immediately start reporting to you, hey, you're actually also hot linking images from this site over here. So no impact, but a really good visibility into what's going on your site, especially if you have a really large site and you're not entirely sure what all your developers are doing. And CSP is particularly designed around preventing and mitigating cross-site scripting. So one of the things that you're able to block or allow is inline scripts. So that's any JavaScript that's just dumped inside of script tags. That's an inline script. Same with on mouse over, on click, event handlers like that. So that's how XSS is tested for by penetration testers. And it's the beginning of an exploit, of developing an exploit. Maybe later on they'll move to a third-party script include, but getting your site to be no unsafe inline compliant, so there's no inline scripts, goes a tremendous way towards blocking cross-site scripting attacks. It's difficult, yes, but it's a great mitigation. And there's a similar one called unsafe eval that just blocks the eval function and the similar ones, anything that executes JavaScript string as source code. Now, I liken content security policy to DEP for the web. So DEP is exploit mitigation for binary executables, x86 and x64. And it prevents code that's dumped into the stack of the program. So in a classic buffer overflow scenario, shell code will be written onto the stack and then executed from the stack. There's no reason that the stack needs to be executable. It can be read-only. So DEP stands for Data Execution Prevention, prevents data, stuff on the stack, from being executed as code. Content security policy prevents JavaScript that's injected into the page from being executed. The page becomes read-only. Now, DEP is an exploit mitigation, not an exploit solution. So the bypass for DEP is called ROP, or return-oriented programming. In a ROP attack, an attacker will reuse code that's already marked as executable to do things that it wasn't intended to do. Similarly, you can construct a ROP attack out of JavaScript to bypass content security policy. You'd reuse JavaScript that's on the page and in allowed domains to do things that you don't intend it to do, like exfiltrate data or something. It's not necessarily easy, but it's still possible. And there's other ways to bypass CSP, DOM-based XSS, and then if you allow me to upload a JavaScript file, then it's kind of game over. But it's not a complete solution for cross-site scripting, but it's a really good exploit mitigation. And with the reporting functionality and report only, it's something that you can start using really quickly to start iteratively improve your security. And we're seeing a trend in browser security in HTTP headers. So content security policy is an HTTP header. X-frame options is another security directive. That's another header. There's another one I can't remember exactly, but it's like X content, MIME type, no sniff. That's another HTTP header. If you don't have a good way to manage HTTP headers on your site, I'd encourage you to get one, because the next two things I'm talking about are also HTTP headers. Strict transport security is really simple. It just says always use SSL. So the first time I visit a site, I do it over HTTP. Then I see this header, strict transport security, and then it's got a max age, so how long it's going to be saved. Your browser remembers this site, only SSL, for that long. And this is designed to prevent SSL stripping attacks. So Moxie is around at the conference somewhere. He wrote a tool called SSL Strip. You will visit a bank, but I, as a man in the middle, have intercepted your connection. I'll talk SSL to the bank, so it doesn't think anything's amiss. But with you, I'll talk plain text, HTTP. So I'm going to see everything that you want to do. And it's very hard to notice this, because browser indicators for doesn't have a certificate and has a certificate are very subtle when you compare them to has a certificate and has a self-signed certificate, giant red page, right? But if you talk to your bank over HTTP, no red page. It's particularly difficult to detect. Lots of people fall prey to it. With strict transport security, your browser will refuse to connect to a site unless it's over SSL, because it knows that the site itself told it, only talk to me over SSL. And your browser will automatically rewrite all subsequent connections to use SSL. And this notion of don't talk to me unless is also the basis behind key pinning. So key pinning pins the public key for a site into your browser. So now it says, don't talk to me unless you're using one of these public keys. You can specify your SSL certificate, so mail.google.com, your end entity certificate, or you can specify your certificate authority. Don't talk to me unless I'm using a certificate signed by VeriSign, because that's where I buy all my SSL certs from. And key pinning has already won like a really big battle in the fight on fraudulent certificates. DigiNotar, Dutch certificate authority, hacked thoroughly, issued hundreds of fraudulent certificates, including star.google.com, that was used to attack hundreds of thousands of people in Iran. It was detected because of key pinning. Chrome ships an experimental version of key pinning that says Google will only use these certificate authorities. And one fellow in Iran, as far as I know, we still don't know his name. It's probably better for him that way. Noticed this red page in Chrome, looked at the cert chain, knew a little bit about SSL, and uploaded this chain to Google support forums. And then shortly thereafter, the Internet Explorer exploded, everything went haywire. So key pinning has already won like a good battle, and we don't even have it in most browsers or on most sites. But there is a problem in both strict transport security, STS, and key pinning. And that's the bootstrapping problem, right? I'm talking to a site, and it's telling me stuff about its security over the same channel it's trying to secure. If I talk to the site for the first time, and I'm being attacked, the intelligent attacker will just strip out these headers, and I'll never know that this site had opted into this better security. And neither one of these technologies, strict transport security or key pinning, really do anything to address this. You can hard code the information into Chrome if you email a guy, but that doesn't really scale very well, and it's going to be pushed out with the next Chrome update. So you get it in, something like 6 to 12 hours. Not quite that much, but neither of them really attempt to address this bootstrapping problem, because it's assumed that the sites that you care about, the sites you want the most security for, you visit relatively frequently, and you do it over a secured channel most of the time. This is designed to help you on those infrequent, insecure channels like visiting a conference. And it's ideally will be cached in the browser for a long time. It's up to the site. PayPal currently uses STS for, I think, like 4 hours, and they're working on bumping that up to a more reasonable time, like a month. But let's talk about SSL and TLS. I'm going to start using TLS more because I'm going to be talking about the specific versions. And we know that there's TLS 1.1 and 1.2, but most people don't actually know what's in them. So TLS 1.1 was mostly designed to fix a theoretical flaw in SSL which related to CBC mode, so cipher block chaining mode of block ciphers. And back when it was published in 2006, it was a theoretical flaw. Last September, it became a very practical flaw. So that's the beast attack that was given at EcoParty, Taidong, and Julian Rizzo. We had a fix for it 5 years before they had an exploit for it, but we still don't actually have the fix deployed. And it did a few other things. It added some security notes, and it removed the weak export ciphers, so RC4 40-bit. So that's officially gone. But it was a very low-key change to TLS. But TLS 1.2 was not low-key. The first thing they did was they added support for AEAD cryptography. So that's authenticated encryption with associated data. And to explain what that means, I have graphs and charts and things. So CBC mode, ECB mode, these are modes of combining a block cipher. You take some plain text, you encrypt it, you get some ciphertext, you take the ciphertext, you decrypt it, you get the plain text. That's fine. Let's add in an attacker. Now, after I ship off my ciphertext to my friend, it's intercepted by the attacker, and he modifies it. He flips random bits in it. He doesn't really know what he's doing, because it's ciphertext, it's confidential, But when it gets to the recipient will decrypt it, and they'll get garbage, because the attacker was just flipping things randomly. Makes sense. But the receiver doesn't know that I didn't send them garbage. There's no integrity in the ciphertext. And that's quite bad. In order to gain integrity, we have to add something. We have to add a message authentication code, or a MAC. And that's what AEAD does. It works the same way. Encrypt some stuff, get ciphertext, decrypt it, get plaintext. But this time, if an attacker modifies the ciphertext, the recipient knows that it was modified. It will get an alert, and you'll get no plaintext. The integrity is built in to the block cipher mode. That sounds pretty cool. TLS already had integrity. We already had a MAC in TLS. So adding in AEAD is adding double integrity. Oftentimes, adding more security isn't a bad thing, but you have to remember there's always an implementation cost. And the implementation cost for TLS was quite large. It changed a lot of data structures. It's one of the reasons why TLS 1.2 is not implemented in a lot of places. And they also changed a whole bunch of other things. This signature algorithms extension really complicated the protocol a ton. And they changed the pseudo-random function. They added some more security notes. They changed the default. They added new cipher suites. There was a lot of stuff in TLS 1.2. And you've seen this chart before. This is my version of it. They're just not implemented. If you want to use it on a server, you have to be using IIS on server 2008 R2 or using mod GNU TLS, which is pretty uncommon. If you want to use it in a browser, IE on Windows 7 or Opera. And in both cases, you have to enable it manually. Opera recently turned off TLS 1.1 and 1.2 by default, and now you have to enable them manually. And then, like I said, the support is just not there in the libraries. NSS is the library that's used by Firefox and Chrome. Not even implemented. Like, it's a bug report that's being worked on, and there's patches going back and forth. In OpenSSL, it's in 1.0.1, which is a beta version. So it's going to take forever for distributions to upgrade. Most of them are still on 0.9.8. And as you can imagine, since it's barely implemented, it's barely deployed. The numbers differ depending on who you ask. Opera, the EFF, and Qualys are all good sources. And the numbers differ, but they all round to 0. So that makes it really handy. And there's a really big problem. Let's say overnight, everyone supported TLS 1.1 and 1.2. We wouldn't gain anything. There's a downgrade attack because there's intolerant SSL implementations out there. It's really unfortunate, and they all misbehave in slightly different ways. Some choke on extensions. Some choke on any offering greater than 1.1. TLS has a built-in protocol negotiation phase, so you can be like, I speak 1.2, and the server says, I speak 1.1, we're going to speak 1.1. It has that. They don't abide by it. And every browser, every client will deal with these intolerances. If it receives a barf from the server, it will reconnect using SSL v3, no extensions, no compression. We will always have the downgrade attack. An attacker can always swallow like the response from the server that you're trying to talk 1.1 or 1.2, send you a barf, and your client will automatically talk SSL v3. You've been downgraded. There's no way to stop it until browsers remove this downgrade feature. And really, that's not going to happen until all the old implementations that make up, different ones, different percentages, but they all misbehave some way. And that's really disappointing, because there's other improvements to TLS coming. One of them is an improvement by Google to speed up the internet. So this is the TLS handshake. What each little message doesn't matter too much, but the important thing to note is there's 2 waits. The client waits twice for responses from the server. It takes 2 round trips. And then I can start sending my encrypted HTTP traffic. And then the thing that everyone always forgets about is there's actually another round trip in the beginning for the TCP handshake. So ultimately, this is slow. We'd like to speed it up. Google came up with something called false start, which removes one of the waits. So now we only wait for one response from the server, and we start sending our HTTP data. So we don't wait to receive this finished message. This finished message is actually what gives the entire protocol its security. Until we receive this finished message from the server, we're not sure that we negotiated things correctly. And here's the attack. I send my list of ciphers that I support to the server, like triple des. The server receives it, says, awesome, I love triple des, we're going to use triple des. And then the attacker changes that to say des. And then I, as the client, say, oh, des, that sucks, I really liked triple des. But OK, fine. I'm going to encrypt my cookie using single des, send it off to the attacker, and at that point, he's won. He's got the first HTTP request, which is usually the most important one. It's got the authentication cookies, the username and password. He's got it, encrypted poorly. If we continue the protocol, the server and I would discover that we've been screwed, but that's a note on the nightstand. It's not too useful. Obviously, the solution is don't use false start with insecure ciphers. Not every SSL implementation is compatible with it. There's about 2,000 sites that are blacklisted by Google in a publicly available list that's linked there. Does you a lot of good, I can tell. But false start is a good improvement over SSL that gives practical performance benefits. And there's some other interesting improvements to TLS, particularly relating around managing your identity. So this slide I stole from an ex-coworker of mine named Brad Hill. He presented at RSA last year. And this last bullet point, finish by fixing the browser to be a smarter protocol participant itself. That's really powerful. Make the browser smarter. So I'm going to talk about a couple ways to do that. We layer a lot of things inside one another that we forget about. So we talk HTTP inside of TLS, inside of TCP, inside of IP or IPsec. We can bind some of these layers together to get better security. And I'm going to show what this means. If I take a cookie and bind it to TLS, then that cookie can only be used in that TLS session. So technically it binds to the finished message. That cookie can only be used in that TLS session. If it's used in any other one, the server will reject it. It'll see that the bind is bad and reject it. It will not authenticate you. Ordinarily, in a man-in-the-middle attack, the man-in-the-middle just kind of forwards the traffic back and forth and reads it. But now it doesn't work, because when the man-in-the-middle forwards that cookie on, the binding is bad. It's in a different TLS session. So this looks good. And even nicer, if someone steals the cookie, they can't use it either, because they can't impersonate the binding. There's two pretty big problems with it, though. The first is it doesn't work on first contact, because you don't have cookies on first contact. And when the attacker gets the cookie, it'll be bound to them. So that's no good. And it also doesn't work with impersonation. If this gentleman right here convinces me that he's my bank, I'll talk to him and I'll send him my cookie, and it'll be useless to him. But he's tricked me into thinking that he's my bank, so he'll do what any smart person would do. He'll say, for your security, we've logged you out. Please re-authenticate. And every single one of us would be like, oh, my bank's so good, log me out. Oh, let me log back in. So it doesn't work with impersonation. And it also breaks persistent cookies. Because if I close my browser and then reopen it, I'm in a new TLS session, and I'd have to re-authenticate. So that's disappointing. But this one we can fix. We want to bind to something in the TLS handshake that is constant across different TLS connections. What if we bound it to a client cert? So now, when I close my browser and restart it, I'm using the client cert. It's the same. And if you stole my cookie, you couldn't use it because you'd also have to steal my client certificate. So this is beginning to look better. But how many of you use client certificates for anything other than work? Okay, one fellow in the back. Client certificates suck. There's lots of reasons why they suck. The enrollment is a big pain in the neck. The browser UI is confusing. You can't port it across devices easily. You're always authenticated. There's no notion of logging out. There's lots of problems with it. And there's a proposal from a couple of folks at Google to fix this using something called origin-bound client certificates. And there's a lot of properties of them. Basically, they're created on demand by your browser when you visit a site that wants one. You never even know you're using it. It's selected automatically and created without without you needing to say anything. Obviously, it can't say who you are because they're just made out of nothing. So they don't change the way a website functions. You still log in and log out. It is a nice way of tracking you, however. So let's say, what if we used origin-bound client certificates and bound our cookies to them? And this proposal comes from browserauth.net, where you can read more about it. So it works with persistent cookies, but we already had those working before, so I can't really count it as a plus. It still doesn't work with impersonation. Still doesn't solve that problem. And it doesn't solve the first contact problem, the bootstrapping problem. And it's another form of web tracking, because even if you're not logged in, they'll still be able to correlate you based on your client cert. But it is a really elegant solution to cookie theft. But we already have pretty good solutions to cookie theft. If we use the HTTP only and the secure attributes on cookies and we use it over TLS, that's pretty good generally. But I have talked to people who say that, no, we are really concerned about credential theft. And if that's you, you can still use channel binding. You can just do it manually. So what if you said this cookie is only valid on Internet Explorer on Windows? And if the next time you see that cookie, it's coming from Firefox on Linux, something strange has happened. And you should probably make the user re-authenticate. That's probably a stolen cookie or a fire sheep or something. So you can bound it to the browser details. And you can bind it to other things like the IP address or the TLS session, but those break other things like persistent cookies or mobile clients. So channel binding is a cryptographic concept that's really useful. It wasn't really designed exactly for cookies, although that may be where we're going to see it wind up. Instead, I want to talk about something where channel binding comes in way more useful. Let's talk about usernames and passwords. So the way web authentication works now is I call up a site and I say, here's my username and password, and they say, yeah, that's definitely what we have for you. Totally. And there's no server authentication there. There's a protocol called Secure Remote Password, or SRP, where we both prove that we know my password, but it's never sent. It's actually kind of similar to Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So here, Alice and Bob derive a secret, S, that never crosses the wire. So a passive eavesdropper never sees the secret, suddenly sees them talking encrypted. That's pretty cool, and it's very similar to SRP. Here, both participants, Alice and Bob, the server and the user, prove that they know the password for the user's account. But it's never sent across the wire. It's never sent in the clear. And, as a nice property, all the passwords are stored on the server hashed. Now, if we started using SRP on the web today, we wouldn't gain anything, because we would just be putting it inside of HTTP, and it would be shuttled across with TLS, and an attacker can do the exact same thing. They just shuttle the messages back and forth. They will never see the password, but they don't need to. So they get your cookies and your account details, and the server thinks they're you, so they can do whatever you can do. So that's no good. What if instead we used SRP for the TLS handshake? So it's built into the TLS handshake, and it's finished when you both prove that you know the password. A man in the middle can never complete the TLS handshake with you unless they know your password. You can never be fooled into tricking to an impersonated site or a man in the middle because they don't know your password. And it's never sent. This sounds really good. It's actually the same problems as client certs. The browser UI is confusing. There's no solving enrollment. Any TLS connection means you're logged in. All those same problems. And kind of doing a hand-wavy origin-bound client cert solution to this is just as bad. Suddenly, you have 2 usernames and passwords for every site. One of them is for your SSL connection. That's just weird. But there's a really big win for this. Think about, what do you use that's always over SSL, that's always authenticated? You're always logged in. How about your email? So what if you used SRP in TLS for Outlook, for Thunderbird? Anytime you talked to your mail server, you could never be tricked into going to a rogue mail server. And if you think about it, there's no certificate patrol plugin for Thunderbird. There's no way to verify that the certificate you get is legit for your mail client. If it's signed by a CA, it's all good as far as it's concerned. Now, your mail server doesn't need a CA signed certificate. It doesn't need a certificate at all. As soon as you complete that TLS handshake, you know you're talking to the legitimate server, and you know it's not man-in-the-middled. Any thick client that uses username and password for authentication and always talks over SSL can benefit from TLS SRP. Now, if you've ever heard of SRP before, you're probably sitting there mumbling, oh, but it's patented. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, and I cannot give legal advice. Actually, I can give legal advice, but I'm not a lawyer. I took a look at this, and more importantly, I took a look at what people smarter than me have said, and they don't really think it's an issue. You're not going to get sued for using TLS SRP. I would encourage you to look into it more, learn about it, and start playing around with it. If you're interested in the issue of identity management, like general multiple identities on the web, how can we solve this, how can we make this simpler, you've all probably heard of OpenID. There's also browser ID and web ID, more complicated proposals from Mozilla and the W3C. There's Facebook Connect, but ew. And there's other stuff. So now I want to spend a couple minutes talking about DNSSEC, because that's, you got to talk about DNSSEC, I suppose. So when people say we're going to use DNSSEC for authenticity, this is what they mean. I talk to a DNS server now, and I get an IP address back. And then I go to that IP address, and I do the TLS handshake. Now, I'm going to get a certificate, or a fingerprint of a certificate, back from my DNS server. And then I'm going to get another certificate in the TLS handshake, and I'm going to compare them. And if they match, sounds good. If they don't match, I get different ones, then something has gone awry. You can actually do this without DNSSEC. You can just do it with plain old DNS, but then the responses are forgeable, and the intelligent attacker will forge the DNS as well as middling the HTTP. Now, what can we put in DNS? All sorts of stuff. SSL certificates is the most obvious one. Put the SSL certificate inside of DNS, sign it with DNSSEC, ship it off to the client, and you could theoretically assert that a self-signed certificate is valid for a site. Chrome actually has something similar to this in it now. It's been in for over a year. It's not exactly this proposal. It's called DANE. That's the IETF working group. And DANE is in its working group last call as of this week. So it's very close to being standardized. You can read a proposal that's pretty much going to be the standard. And hopefully we're going to see it in browsers very soon. You can also put your SSH fingerprint inside of DNS. So if you SSH to a lot of servers, you see that, this is the fingerprint of the server. Do you trust it? And, if you're really paranoid, you actually go verify it somehow. You can stick it in DNS and then, automatically trust as long as they match from DNS and SSH. If you're one of the few people like me that uses OpenPGP, you can put your PGP key in DNS. And if you're one of the few people that uses SMIME, you will soon be able to put your SMIME certificate inside of DNS. But DNS, I have to give that little asterisk. You want to trust the server, but you're actually trusting the chain. There's a certificate authority, or something very similar to it, embedded in DNSSEC. VeriSign is the company that runs the .com domain and .net as well. And in turn, ICANN runs the root. So you might say VeriSign is pretty trustworthy, but there's other companies like Affilius. And then there's the country code TLDs, so you're trusting whatever country runs that country code TLD. It depends on your level of paranoia. Some people, this is fine. For other people, it's a non-starter because they don't want to trust the chain. So you have to make that decision individually, but it's important to note. And talking about who do you trust, now we're going to get into public key infrastructure. So we have a problem with revocation. We actually have a problem with trust too, but I'm going to get to that. Some CAs are negligent and don't know they need to revoke. Other CAs know they need to revoke, but they have no good way of doing it. They literally have to call up all the browser vendors and say, we need a patch, and we need to embargo this information before so the patch can get out. That's what Komodo did. You know, they planned on releasing it, but like 2 weeks after, you know, the patches had been deployed. And one guy who actually watched certificate revocation lists caught it earlier. We have 3 ways of revoking certificates, and we have to rely on software patches. The first is CRLs. It's what it sounds like. It's a list of certificates that are revoked. They're published about every 2 days. They're refreshed on your client about once a week, or never. Sometimes you have to add CRLs to your browser manually, and I've never met anyone who's ever actually manually added a CRL. And also they're large, so they can get 60, 70, 700 kilobytes, which is a problem for mobile phones. So a lighter weight protocol is devised, and that's OCSP, the Online Certificate Status Protocol. I receive a certificate from a server, and then I say, hey, this was issued by VeriSign. I'm going to go ask VeriSign if it's still valid. And VeriSign says, yes, it is still valid. Obviously, this has a big problem in that it's slow. I have to make yet another request on top of the 4 I already had. And there's also some privacy implications. So suddenly VeriSign knows what sites I'm visiting. And it's also a single point of failure. So this site's uptime is now tied to VeriSign's OCSP responder. And there's a whole mess of interesting information about that I talk about in the white paper because I don't have complete time to cover it on stage. But trying to fix OCSP was what led us to OCSP stapling. So now the server will get a validity check from the certificate authority ahead of time. And when you receive the certificate, you'll also get a signed response from the CA that's good for 24, 48 hours. And you'll know, oh, this is still good. This looks pretty good. It solves the privacy problem, solves the single point of failure problem, solves the side channel problem. Unfortunately, it's not really implemented anywhere. So Apache 2.4 just came out 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago with support for this. So it's lagging behind. And it's also important to note that all 3 of these are based off of serial numbers. So a certificate authority would never issue 2 certificates with the same serial number. Right? Google is ditching OCSP and going straight to pushed CRLs. So they have a really good browser update mechanism. They're going to enhance that to push you certificate revocation information. So let's talk about fixing PKI. I wanted to draw out commonalities among all of these proposals for abolishing or enhancing certificate authorities. And we've seen a couple already. So we know that bootstrapping trust is hard. That's why we have CAs in the first place, as a trusted introducer. And what we'd really like is to see security policy being dictated from the site. So the site will tell you what it considers secure, what it considers abnormal. We saw that in STS, in key pinning, in DANE, in content security policy, in lots of things. And there's another one. Certificate policy anomalies, they can be reported to the site. You, as a site owner, would like to know if something weird is going on your site. You would like your users to tell you that. So, of course, they're not actually going to email you and tell you that, so you need some automated mechanism. And this gets very, hazy with like phone homes and privacy things, but generally speaking, it's a good idea to report anomalies to the server. Content security policy, great example of that. So, there's a really good presentation set of slides from Peter Gutmann. He's an old school PKI guy. And his idea is really simple. Just be smarter. Just be smarter. Your laptop knows when it's on an unsecure wireless network. Your browser knows if things look weird on a site. It's just not telling you. Is this an American site that's, from an American company that's hosted in Iran? Is this a NetBlock that was registered like 6 months ago? Or is this a NetBlock that's been used by the same company for 18 years? Is the DNS, is the TTL really low? That's suspicious. Am I talking to a home modem? Is my bank operating on a cable modem? That seems really weird. And most powerfully, do I visit this site often? Is this the same site that I put in my credentials every day for the last year? Or is this a site that I'm going to give a username and password to that I've never seen before? And you can even be smarter on the certificate authority side. Is this a website that's in the Alexa top 100? Maybe I should pay a little more attention to it. Does it have an extended validation certificate? So that's like the really fancy SSL cert. And am I replacing it with a bottom of the barrel, like 999 domain validated cert? That's really suspicious. Is this an American site hosted in America and the certificate request is coming from Iran? Maybe I should be smarter about this. Maybe I should put in some more manual checks on the CA's side. Just be smarter. Security policy, if it's not dictated to us, can be learned and guessed at. And the moment you start getting this variance of trust for a site, you get variance of trust for a site. It's not, do I trust this, do I not trust this? How much do I trust this? I trust this a lot because I visit this site often. It's from a reputable company that has been hosted in the same place for a long time. The certificate authority they've used has remained constant for 10 years. There's tons of things that you can feed in, and this is a graph that's stolen from Peter Gutmann. There's tons of things you can feed in to make a risk-based assessment for a browser. Now, of course, it's kind of hard. You have to build it, but it's still possible. And of course, building things is hard, and convincing the certificate authorities of anything is even harder. There's an organization that exists called the CA Browser Forum, the CAB Forum. It's a group of CAs and a group of browsers. As you can see, it's a little lopsided between the two. So they're not going to be doing anything too revolutionary. Or are they? So like 2 weeks ago, they announced a reform group because people are unhappy with how the CAB Forum has been operating. So if you're interested in this stuff, I would encourage you to check out the CAB Forum because this new reform group might actually be something. But what it is right now, what the CAB Forum is right now, is a set of guidelines that they published a few months ago. Obviously, they're not revolutionary. They're mostly around public-facing documents. So their certificate issuing policies must be public. Their audits must be publicly available. So if you need some bedtime reading, you can read security audits for certificate authorities. There's some stuff about revocation. There must be some revocation possibility available. You must be able to report problems to the CA publicly somehow. But we're not seeing a whole lot of reform out of the CAB Forum yet. And I want to cover a couple more concepts before I dig into the proposals to fix PKI. And the first set of concepts come from Adam Langley, who's an SSL engineer at Google. He actually runs the entire SSL infrastructure for all of Google. He's pretty cool. The first, a public versus a private system. We have a private system. Any certificate, you trust it, even if you've never seen it, as long as it's signed by a CA. In a public system, the certificate must be public for it to be trusted. Side channels or not. So this is an extra request required for you to determine if a cert is valid. So OCSP, big side channel. OCSP stapling, no side channel. And then the one that everyone forgets about, and that's clocks. So do you have an accurate clock? Because a digital signature usually requires an accurate clock to know if it's valid or not. And not everyone actually has a synced clock. So, extra network trips are bad. Browsers aren't likely to implement any solution that requires extra network trips. And, have to remember about clocks. And the last concept before diving into the proposals is who do you trust and for how long? So, comes from Moxie, trust agility. I want to be able to change who I trust, and I want to be able to not break things when I change it. So that ability to change the trusted party is obviously desirable. So there's a couple of categories of proposals for fixes, and the first is network perspectives. So the oldest one, and the one people have heard about the most, is perspectives. So I get a certificate from a server. I'm going to talk to another server called a notary, and I'm going to say, hey, what do you see? And it's going to check the server, and it's going to get the certificate, it's going to send it to me, and then I can compare them. And if they match, I assume it's good. And the reason I assume it's good is because if I'm being attacked, a man in the middle is going to be localized to some network. Maybe it's my local network, maybe it's a slightly broader network, like an entire country. But it's still going to be localized. And when I get this bad certificate back, as long as I talk to enough notaries, I'm going to see that it's bad, and I won't trust it. Ideally, I talk to notaries all over the world. Network perspectives will only tell you what others see. They won't tell you if it's valid or not. A very interesting attack, what if I hacked into your production server and changed your SSL certificate? It was CA signed, but it's a new SSL certificate. How many of you would notice? Something to think about. Moxie proposed an upgrade of perspectives called convergence. So now, when I talk to a notary, that notary can do other things than just tell me what it sees. So I can validate a domain via DNSSEC. Via DNSSEC. But actually, if I wanted to validate a site through Dan Kaminsky, I could do that. He could run a notary where he just calls up sites and asks them what their fingerprints are, and then he says, yes, this is what this customer service rep told me. You could also talk to a database like the EFF Observatory or the Google Cert Catalog. And notaries are intended to be extensible. They can do anything. And you can choose which notaries to trust based on their policies. It does a few other things for perspectives related to privacy. So a big point in convergence was making it improving the privacy of the system. So privacy does matter. We want to learn. We want to keep in mind, who am I asking if this certificate is valid? Because I may not want to tell them that. And the other one is users don't change defaults. This is especially pertinent for notary systems. The reason why convergence won't be implemented in Chrome, according to the Chrome team, is because the default set of notaries that are hard-coded into Chrome won't be changed for 99.99% of their 250 million users. If those notaries go down, Chrome stops working. And obviously that's not acceptable to them. The next set of proposals are based around public accountability. There's a proposal from the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an organization in the US, called sovereign keys. It boils down to you make a key, a sovereign key, one key, and all of your keys will then be signed by that key. Your sovereign key, that big key, is published to a public server, and all the subsequent keys will be signed by it, so you can trust them. It's actually way more complicated. There's mirroring servers, there's keeping track of what CAs are trusted at what time, there's a protocol to automatically distrust servers. It's also really slow, so there's a lot of drawbacks to sovereign keys. But the idea of publishing certificates publicly is also the basis behind CA transparency and auditability. Its acronym is CT. All certificates, every single one, will be published in a public audit log that is append only. So you can't fraudulently stick things in the log or remove things from the log. And clients will receive a proof that the certificate exists in the log. So you receive the certificate, you receive the proof that it's in the log, and you trust it because you assume that an attacker, a good attacker, would not want to publish this certificate that he stole in this public log for everyone to find and then distrust. CT does have some issues. First off, it doesn't address revocation. So revocation is still a problem. We need to solve that somehow. And there's some other issues. It does have some nice properties like no side channels, and CAs do all the work, right? So CAs can run the logs, and server operators don't have to do anything. So we have to remember who's going to do the work. Is it the browsers, the server operators, the certificate authorities, or the users? And how much work is there to be done? And then finally, public doesn't mean correct, it just means public. And there's a couple more things, a couple more proposals that are skewed even more oddly. Certificate patrol is useful for the people in this room only. It tells you when an SSL certificate changed. You are all smart enough to look at this change in SSL certificate and determine if it's an intelligent change or a weird one. Your mother or your grandmother most likely are not. But here's something way out of left field. And I wanted to throw at least one thing out of left field up here, and that's URLs. So how many of you know Tor hidden services? Okay, a few people. So the top URL is a Tor hidden service. The bottom URL is a URL. Y URL. And that weird thing, that ununderstandable blob, that's your certificate that you're going to speak to. You know ahead of time what certificate you will accept. And you're actually going to hunt around for it. This is just the first place to look. It can forward you on. But you know who you're talking to because you already have the certificate. And this goes back to a concept called Zuku's triangle. It says there are three properties that participants in a network protocol can have. Secure, human meaningful, and decentralized. Secure is, am I talking to the right person? Decentralized, is there a central authority? And then human meaningful, can your grandma remember it? HTTPS aims for the left side. So they're definitely not decentralized. We have certificate authorities. They're central. And we get secure through them, and we get human meaningful because the domain name is human meaningful. Lately, we've kind of lost secure, and we just have human meaningful. But URLs, they say, we're going to do secure, and we're going to do it different. I know I'm talking to the right person because I already have their public key. I will assume that whoever has the private key to this public key is the right person. And I'm going to hunt around until I find them. So going back to the basics is sometimes useful to consider these proposals. So I'm under 5 minutes, so I'm going to wind down. These are the things that kind of need your help that are pretty cool. Secure mode password could really use a boost. And TLS 1.1.1.2, like we're just not going to see it for a while, a couple of years until browsers remove this downgrade capability and until it starts getting implemented and deployed. Key pinning coming very soon. It's in draft status. Hopefully, it'll be in browsers by the end of the year. And then these are things that you can start using right away. So content security policy, strict transport security. You can make sure your site works with false start. You can stick stuff in DNS. You can start using channel binding if cookie theft is a big concern to you. And you can start using OCSP stapling. Or if you have a good relationship with your CA, you can bug them about OCSP stapling. And then, like I said, I had way more stuff than I could cover in a single hour. This is the stuff, there's actually more stuff than this because I was cutting things out as early as this morning. Way more stuff on TLS, like datagram TLS and encrypted client certs. Stuff about improvements to JavaScript cryptography. We're working on that. Weird things. Way more CA resolution proposals. There's like 8 more, I think, that go into really weird things, like the web of trust in SSL certificates. But ultimately, thank you very much for coming. My name is Tom Ritter. I work for ISEC Partners, if you stayed from Don's talk, same company. We are a security consulting firm out of the US in San Francisco, New York, Seattle. We are hiring security consultants, and obviously we provide security consulting services. So thank you very much for attending. And if you have any questions, I have maybe a minute or two.
So you've got strict transport security, so the site can specify, please use HTTPS and not HTTP. But that site will still be subject to a downgrade to SSL-v3 in the future when they deploy TLS 1 or 2. So can a site specify, please use TLS 1 or 2?
No. The question was, can a site specify the exact version of TLS that they want to use? Basically, until the downgrade attack is removed from clients, browsers in particular, no. You could, as an option on the server, say, I will only speak TLS 1.2, but you're basically going to block tons and tons and tons of clients because it's not supported in browsers. So I guess the answer is actually yes. You could do it on the server side in the stack, the SSL stack. You could do it in an Apache option, but not with strict transport security. And that's a really crazy thing to do because we're not going to see 1.2 like pervasive for years and years.
As I think about this CSD content security policy, it seems to me as the best design pattern under most circumstances would be to disallow scripting on itself entirely and then have all scripts on a separate host or at least separate subdomain, as most, if not all, custom scripting exploits tend to inject scripts into itself.
Absolutely, yeah. So comment was about content security policy. Like you said, the best way to deploy CSP is to prevent all inline scripts, only load things from your own domain or your own subdomain.
Shared secret key by which you can just use any secure hash algorithm to hash the already known password. So I mean, I see no reason why that should be illegal or at least patentable.
Right. It works actually very similar to Diffie-Hellman. The math behind it works in fields and the discrete logarithm problem. Yeah, I also it's like it's a couple equations of math, so it's really weird how it's patented. Yay us. I don't know. Any other questions? No other questions. You'll have to grab me right now, anytime around the conference. You can bug me about the presentation, TLS, or ISEC Partners. Thank you very much.